What? That was the worst Spider-Man cartoon. Firestar? Iceman? Really? He never hung out with those guys. Would you hang out with Iceman? Hello, my friends, hello! And welcome, once again, to stately Von Manor. And I've got this terrible child who keeps wanting to get in my way and interrupt my video. Listen, it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue, on his video, will talk about that same graphic novel, comic book, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team-up that we do once a week. And this week, we need to talk about Spider-Man, don't we? We need to talk about Spider-Man. Let me get rid of my amazing friend here real quick. Here, go. Mind your own doggy business there for a second, because we're going to be talking about Spider-Man. Yes, Spider-Man. So, I want to talk about Spider-Man. Not a specific Spider-Man story, even though I'm holding this up. Not a specific Spider-Man story, but the character of Spider-Man. Why has Spider-Man been so popular since he first showed up on the scene in 1962? That's right, he showed up in 1962, way back in the olden days. And he showed up here in Amazing Fantasy number it was 15, right? Yeah, Amazing Fantasy number 15 with this great cover by Jack Kirby based on the character design of Steve Ditko. So, what makes this character so popular and so important? Because Spider-Man is an important character. He's also been a tremendously influential character. Has that influence always been for good? Steve Donoghue and I might have some differing opinions on this. So let's talk about Spider-Man. Now, Spider-Man was created 9 years before I even existed. But he was already super popular right away. And I first read Spider-Man in pocketbooks, in a pocketbooks edition of the first 6 issues of Spider-Man. And it was really cool. It was really tiny. It was really tiny, this book. This book had the first 6 issues of Spider-Man. So at least I started from the beginning in my first reading of Spider-Man. But it was literally the tiniest thing. I mean, they printed a whole page on a paperback book size page. So it was tiny. Only little children, I think, could read this. But I loved it, and I read it over and over again. There were 2 more that came after this one, and I had both of those, and I read them over and over again. I loved them. I loved Spider-Man. This wasn't the first time I encountered Spider-Man. The first time I encountered Spider-Man was when I was a wee little child, and the 1960s Spider-Man cartoon was on every single day. I'm pretty sure that's the first time I even experienced the character or encountered the character, was from that cartoon, which, if you watch it now, is not so great. But when you're a little tiny kid, it's awesome. So, Spider-Man is a character that I've been aware of my entire life. I literally can't remember the first time I heard or saw Spider-Man. Spider-Man's been around my whole life and has been popular the whole time, really popular. And the reason for that, I think, well, there's a few different reasons. For one thing, Spider-Man perfectly encapsulates Stan Lee's vision for superheroes. And that is superheroes that exist in a more realistic world than than DC Comics, the distinguished competition. There was a time when DC Comics was king, but DC's comic books, the characters in those comics back in the 60s, They didn't have a ton of personality, let's say. They never experienced any real world problems at all. Very kind of simple stories, simple scenarios. If you well, I shouldn't say that because that's unfair. DC Comics actually had some pretty complex scenarios and situations in their comics, but the characters themselves, I should say, were kind of simple. I mean, the personality-wise, if you were to read the Justice League, none of these characters had different personalities. They were just all the hero. Whereas that wasn't the case with Marvel Comics. This disturbs my partner in Epic Comic Book Wednesdays, Steve Donoghue, who only likes comics if they're written for small children. But these comics, Marvel Comics, were a little bit more mature in that we had characters finally that had real world problems, and nobody epitomized that more than Spider-Man. Peter Parker and Spider-Man. In Spider-Man, unlike some of the other Marvel characters, he was himself right out of the gate. The very first Spider-Man story, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko got Spider-Man right. This was kind of unusual. Usually it took an issue or two or three or four to nail down the character. It took a while to get the Hulk right. It took a couple issues to get the Fantastic Four just right. Spider-Man, right out of the gate, he was great. And he was always that character. Young Peter Parker, who was 16 years old when he became Spider-Man. I'm pretty sure he was 16. So he was a high school student, very relatable to most of the kids reading the comic books, who were about that age, 14, 15, 16 years old. The target audience of Spider-Man back in the early 60s. So we have this really relatable character because he was. Peter Parker acted, he behaved like a real teenager. He could be insensitive, he could be a jerk. He didn't always think things out before he did them. He didn't always think out the things he said before he said them. You know, he was a kid. And he was a really relatable kid. He had a good heart, and he was a super genius. Now, that part wasn't quite so realistic. You know, he just, I need webs. I think I'll just make them in my bedroom in one evening. That part wasn't so realistic, but that's okay. You know, in comic books, you got to give a lot of things passes. That was easy. That was an easy pass. As far as the creation of Spider-Man goes, Spider-Man, I think, had the personality and the viewpoint of a young Stan Lee. I think Stan Lee was kind of writing a young version of himself when he was writing Spider-Man. I think that's probably one of the reasons this character was so realistic. He seemed more realistic and more engaging than most of the other Marvel superheroes. This is one of the secrets of his popularity, I think. He also had a great costume. Now, when Stan Lee first envisioned this character, he gave it to Jack Kirby to illustrate. And Stan Lee's idea of a costume for Spider-Man, by all accounts, was not that great. Pretty basic superhero costume. He didn't have web shooters. He had a gun that shot webs, which was a bad idea, and they realized that right away before they did the final story. But the Jack Kirby version apparently wasn't all that great because he drew it just the way Stan Lee asked him to. So then Stan got Steve Ditko, who did the weirdest costume anybody had ever seen at this point in a superhero comic book. Spider-Man must have just seemed so strange, his costume. But it was cool and it was mysterious. He was completely covered. He could have literally been anybody underneath this costume. So, people wouldn't know, for example, that he was a teenage kid. I mean, there probably would have been some real clues in real life, but in comic book land, nobody would know that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. He could have literally been anybody. And there was bunch of stuff about this comic book right out of the gate that was interesting. Peter Parker was an orphan. He was being raised by his aunt and uncle. His uncle was murdered. Spider-Man had the chance, or Peter Parker had the chance, to stop his uncle's murderer and didn't. This is before his uncle was murdered. A cop asked him to stop this guy who was a robber, and Spider-Man's like, who was in show business at this point. This is before he became a superhero. It's like, nah, I'm not going to bother to do that. Because he's like a teenage kid. What does he care? And of course, this guy later on kills his uncle. His Uncle Ben. And this is where Spider-Man learns that with great power comes great responsibility. I mean, it should. I mean, in real life, it doesn't always work that way. But with great power, great responsibility should come along with that. It just, in real life, it doesn't always. But so we have Peter Parker, who is motivated not by a sense of justice or vengeance. He's motivated by guilt, really. That's what initially gets him to be a superhero. He feels guilty for not stopping this criminal who later killed his uncle. He feels responsible for that. And so he's always carrying around that guilt. And he does develop, because of this, a sense of responsibility. And that's really what keeps him in the game. Sometimes he throws away his costume and gets all pissy and says, I'm never going to be Spider-Man again. An issue or two later, or even in the same issue, he's going to be Spider-Man again. Peter Parker was just a really engaging, realistic, interesting character. He was fun to read. These early comics by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, and later on, the comics that came after this, for a long time, were really, really entertaining. They were just fun. Stan Lee's Spider-Man comics are always worth reading. Back when John Romita took over the book, it was actually even better, if that's possible. John Romita did some beautiful work on Spider-Man. Spider-Man had the best villains. As far as superheroes with rogues galleries, in my opinion, and this is my opinion, Spider-Man had the best villains. Dr. Octopus, Mysterio, Electro. Who else is on here? Sandman, Kraven the Hunter. He had great villains, Spider-Man did. Consistently. Not all of them were winners, but most of Spider-Man's villains were pretty great. I think his villains actually, with maybe one or two exceptions, even beat Batman's villains. And Batman had some great villains. Spider-Man, I think, probably had the best. Easily the most popular character Marvel Comics ever had. Spider-Man also did something kind of interesting that doesn't get talked about too much when we talk about this character, and that is he aged. For a while, he aged. You get the feeling that when Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and John Romita and everybody were doing these books, they could have no idea that this character would last as long as he has. How would they know? So they did something different. Spider-Man, not only did he have real life problems, he seemed to exist in a real world because unlike every other superhero that seemed to exist, he got older. His life changed. He started off as a teenager, got older, went to college, got a job. Later on, he got another job. He actually grew up and grew older, this character, to a point. But that was interesting to see, and it had not been done before this point, I don't think. I can't think of any other superhero that didn't just remain static and was always at a certain point in their life and had certain relationships And these things never changed from one adventure to the next. Steve Donoghue will tell you that this is the way comics should be. They should end exactly as they started, so that by the next issue, you just have another adventure that starts the way the last one ended and ends the way it started. That's, you know, and that's fine for a DC comic book. Here's my personal opinion. In my opinion, Marvel Comics and DC Comics started off as two very different kinds of comic book companies. And comic books, here's the thing about comic books. They could tell any kind of story. There were horror comic books, Western comic books, every kind of comic book you could think of, there was a comic book for it. Superheroes took over, but even after their takeover, there's still other kinds of comic books that show up. Because, like I said, you can tell any kind of story. Horror, science fiction, anything. And not all comic book companies have to be the same. DC could have built on their strengths and continued making great stories as DC Comics, as they originally were, and Marvel could have done their own thing. The only thing was, these happened to be a lot more entertaining to a lot more people because of the very things that Stan Lee brought to comic books. That is just a fact. And so Marvel became much more popular, and DC decided they needed to be more like Marvel. That's probably where the problem came in for DC, because DC, it wasn't and never could be Marvel. DC's still trying to be like Marvel, and they still can't do it. Oh well. Spider-Man was the ultimate version of that. Eventually, as the years kept rolling by, Spider-Man had to stop aging. I think Spider-Man stopped aging somewhere around 30. He was never allowed to get older than that. I think it's probably around 30. I don't think his age is mentioned too much in comic books, for obvious reasons. And this is a problem with all comic books that try to exist in a real world. DC really shouldn't have this problem. They do now, but they shouldn't. Because those comic books always could have existed in kind of a never land where, you know, it was always right now. But with Marvel, the way they fixed this problem is no matter what the story is, the origin story was like 10 years ago or something. It was always a certain amount of time ago. And as the stories progress in the future, the time of their origins just go along with them. So there's always the same amount of time, and nobody ever ages. It's not a perfect solution, but that seems to be what they do. And so you have this ageless Peter Parker. And I think as comic books changed and got more mature, I think Spider-Man suffered, actually, from it. Having this character who was envisioned to be one way kind of stuck in a static place. And so now they're trying to figure out all these different things they could do with Spider-Man. Like, maybe we'll make a clone of him. And he was the clone the whole time. No, he wasn't. He wasn't the clone the whole time. Spider-Man is a character, because he's been around so long, we've had some just great Spider-Man stories, and we have some awful Spider-Man stories. And one of the issues that has plagued comic books now is the fact that we can retcon everything. Any change in a comic book we don't like, we can just make it like it didn't exist. The most cowardly instance of this was in a Spider-Man comic. Spider-Man and Mary Jane eventually got married. It was a big deal. And for whatever reason, Marvel decided they wanted Spider-Man and Mary Jane not to be married. so they made them unmarried. Magically. Literally, magically. And it was cowardly. It's that kind of thing. Comic books don't have stakes anymore because you can undo everything. No matter what happens in a comic, it could be changed. But in the olden days, when Stan Lee was doing these comic books, it didn't feel that way. Those kinds of retcons hadn't been invented yet. And so for pure Spider-Man, which is the older stuff for me, I mean, I'm not sure that there was ever a comic that was better than this. I'm not sure that there was. I think the early issues of Spider-Man, written by Stan Lee and drawn by John Romita and Steve Ditko, were probably the greatest comic books that have ever been done. And Spider-Man, because of that, is one of the most important comic book characters ever. They never seem to get him right in the films or the cartoons for me. I know the films have been very popular because Spider-Man is very popular, and there's a lot of things about those movies that I love, but they never seem to get Peter Parker quite right, in my opinion. But that could just be my opinion. My goodness, I've gone on at length about Spider-Man. I'll shut up now. Boy, I know I rambled. He's giving me a hard time as usual. We'll catch you next time. Be sure to catch Steve Donoghue on his channel. He will have many different things to say, I'm sure, about Spider-Man. Thanks, guys.